In 1974, a woman hit a note so precise that recording engineers assumed their equipment had malfunctioned. It hadn't. That sound came from a human voice, shaped by nothing more than a church choir and raw natural gift. 12 recordings are about to prove the 1970s produced vocal talent this industry has never fully replaced. Number 12. Curtis Mayfield. Before Curtis Mayfield ever stepped into a solo career, he had already rewritten the sound of Chicago soul from inside a vocal group, singing in a falsetto so light it seemed to float above the instruments rather than sit inside them. When he finally stepped out on his own, that falsetto became something else entirely. A weapon of quiet defiance. Move On Up opens with horns that feel like a parade starting somewhere down the block. And then Mayfield's voice arrives, unhurried, almost conversational, telling a black audience in 1970 that the world was still theirs to claim. What made it extraordinary was restraint. Mayfield never oversang the message. He let the falsetto carry the optimism, while the lyrics carried the weight, a balancing act few vocalists of any era have managed. Listen closely to the way he holds certain syllables, just a fraction longer than expected, stretching hope into sound. There is no shouting, no vocal fireworks, and yet the record builds into something enormous, propelled entirely by conviction rather than volume. Mayfield had spent years writing hits for other singers to perform, shaping voices that were not his own. And when he finally trusted his own instrument to carry a message this large, he proved something the industry had underestimated. A falsetto could be gentle and still be unshakable. It could whisper and still demand to be heard. Critics later called Move On Up one of the most influential vocal performances in soul history, not because of range or power, but because of exactly how much Mayfield refused to give away. Every held note feels earned. Every phrase feels considered. That kind of discipline rarely gets celebrated the way raw power does. Yet without it, the entire song collapses into ordinary funk. Instead, it became an anthem, sampled and covered for decades. Its central vocals still instantly recognizable within 2 seconds. Mayfield proved that in the 1970s, greatness did not always announce itself. Sometimes, it simply moved on up, one unhurried phrase at a time, and let history catch up to what it had witnessed. Engineers at Curtom Records, the label Mayfield built so he could control his own vocal sound without outside interference, described a perfectionist who would redo a falsetto phrase a dozen times, chasing a single degree of lightness. Most listeners would never consciously notice. That obsession with texture over volume is precisely why the record has aged the way it has. The voice sitting outside of time, gliding above the arrangement, patient and unbothered, all the way to the fade. Number 11. Russell Thompkins Jr. and the Stylistics. Russell Thompkins Jr. did not sound like other men on record, and that was the entire point. His tenor sat so far into falsetto territory that early listeners assumed the Stylistics had a woman singing lead, a mistake Thompkins heard so often it became almost a running joke inside the group. On You Are Everything, recorded in 1971, with Tom Bell producing, that voice becomes something closer to an instrument of pure vulnerability. There is no growl to hide behind, no lower register to retreat into when the emotion gets uncomfortable. Thompkins stays exposed in that high, fragile place for the entire performance, and somehow it never breaks. Vocal coaches have pointed to this recording specifically because sustaining that register with this much control for this long without strain creeping into the tone requires a kind of technical mastery that sounds effortless only because the difficulty has been completely concealed. Tom Bell's arrangement gives him almost nowhere to hide, stripping the instrumentation back at key moments so the voice stands nearly alone. That was a calculated risk. A lesser vocalist would have been exposed as thin or forced. Thompkins instead sounds inevitable, as though no other voice could have carried this particular song. Philadelphia International's sound during this era leaned heavily on lush orchestration. Yet, You Are Everything proves the arrangement was never the star. It was built entirely around what Thompkins could do that almost nobody else attempted at this level, holding delicate falsetto phrases with the emotional weight most singers reserve for full chest belting. The song became one of the defining records of the Philly soul sound. And decades later, vocalists still study Thompkins' phrasing specifically for how he manages tension without ever letting the note waver. It remains one of the most technically demanding falsetto performances committed to tape in that entire decade. Delivered by a man who simply made it sound like breathing. What rarely gets discussed is how young Thompkins was when he recorded it. Barely into his 20s, already carrying the vocal responsibility for one of Philadelphia's most successful groups. Later vocalists attempting to cover the song in that same register have frequently had to drop the key, unable to hold the tone with the same clarity across a full performance. A gap between Thompkins' effortless-sounding original and nearly every reproduction since, that is, by itself, the clearest evidence of how rare his instrument actually was.
Here's something most people don't realize. Only about 10% of you watching will hit subscribe. The other 90% just watch and move on. You made it this far, so you're clearly not most people. Hit subscribe. Back to the countdown.
Number 10. Stevie Wonder. By 1976, Stevie Wonder had already proven he could write hit after hit. But As, from the album Songs in the Key of Life, revealed something different about his voice entirely. This was not a pop performance chasing radio length. It stretched past 7 minutes, and Wonder used every one of them to demonstrate a vocal elasticity that few singers of his generation could match. He moves from a controlled, almost meditative lower register into full-throated gospel intensity, without any visible seam between the two, as though his voice simply refuses to acknowledge the boundary other vocalists respect. Musicians who worked alongside Wonder in the studio have described watching him record vocal takes with an intuitive sense of where a phrase needed to bend or break. Decisions made in the moment, rather than planned in advance. Blind since infancy, Wonder built his entire relationship with sound around listening rather than watching, and As reflects an artist who trusts his ear completely, layering harmonies with himself, stacking call and response patterns that turn one voice into what sounds like an entire congregation. The final minutes of the recording push into a vocal intensity that many singers only reach when performing live under adrenaline. Yet Wonder captured it in a controlled studio environment, take after take, until the performance matched the ambition of the song's message about unconditional, eternal commitment. Songs in the Key of Life would go on to be recognized as one of the most significant albums in American music history. And As is frequently cited by vocalists and producers alike as proof of Wonder's technical range at the peak of his creative powers. It is not a song built for easy replication. Few have tried to cover it in full, and fewer still have matched the physical stamina and emotional command Wonder brought to every single one of its 7 minutes. Session players present for the recording have described Wonder directing an entire choir of backing vocalists by ear alone, adjusting individual harmony parts on the spot, without ever referencing written sheet music, something most producers in that era relied on constantly. That level of internal command over a wall of voices built entirely from memory and instinct is part of why musicians still treat As less like a pop song and more like a case study a recording that keeps revealing new vocal detail on every subsequent listen, no matter how many times it has already been heard. Number 9. Bill Withers. Bill Withers never trained as a singer. He worked as an assembly technician making airplane toilets before music paid enough to quit. And that unpolished, unglamorous origin is audible in every syllable of Ain't No Sunshine, recorded in 1971. There is nothing showy about his voice. It is low, plain, almost conversational, and that plainness became the song's greatest strength. When Withers reaches the section where he repeats the phrase "I know" over and over, 26 times by most counts, it was never meant to stay in the final mix. Producers originally planned to write actual lyrics for that section, but Withers had left the repetition in as a placeholder, unsure what else to say, and the take that survived was raw enough that nobody wanted to touch it. That accident became one of the most emotionally devastating vocal moments of the decade, precisely because it sounds like a man losing his composure in real time rather than performing loss for an audience. Withers was 33 years old when the song broke, older than most new artists breaking through. And that maturity shaped how he sang. He did not reach for dramatic runs or ornamentation. He let silence and repetition do work that vocal acrobatics never could. Session musicians on the record, including a young Stephen Stills on guitar, later said Withers' vocal take made the entire room stop talking. He recorded it live with the band. No overdub tricks. No vocal comping from multiple takes. What listeners hear is the single performance that happened in that room on that day. Rolling Stone would later rank the song among the greatest of all time. And much of that reputation rests entirely on a voice that refused to oversell its own heartbreak. Proving that in the 1970s, the most powerful instrument in R&B was sometimes simple, plain-spoken restraint. Withers famously remained wary of the music industry for the rest of his career, having watched other artists lose control of their own material. And that same guardedness is arguably audible in the vocal itself, a man who gives listeners real feeling without ever fully performing for them. He would later say in interviews that he never considered himself a great singer in the technical sense, insisting his only skill was meaning what he said while the tape was rolling. Vocal historians tend to disagree with his own modesty, pointing specifically to this recording as proof that emotional truth, captured without artifice, can outlast far more technically ambitious performances by decades. Number 8. Gladys Knight. Gladys Knight had already spent nearly 2 decades performing by the time Midnight Train to Georgia reached number 1 in 1973. And that experience is audible in every controlled, weathered phrase. This was not a young ingenue chasing a trend. This was a voice that had toured relentlessly since childhood, and it carried the texture of that history, a slight rasp, a lived-in lower register that made every lyric about giving up big city dreams for love sound like something she had actually lived. What separates Knight's performance is the tension between resignation and pride running through the entire vocal. She never sounds pitiful, even singing about her man's failed dreams and her decision to follow him home. Knight's tone carries dignity, never collapsing into melodrama the way a less disciplined vocalist might. The pips behind her respond with call and response harmonies, but it is Knight's lead that dictates the emotional temperature of the entire record, rising and falling with total control. Producer Tony Camillo has spoken about how few takes the vocal actually required, because Knight arrived already understanding exactly how she wanted the story told. The song had actually been written with a different destination in the lyrics originally, and reportedly changed before Knight ever recorded her version. Yet nothing about her delivery suggests a performer adapting to unfamiliar material. It sounds inevitable. Midnight Train to Georgia would go on to win the Grammy for Best R&B Vocal Performance.
but he sure found out the hard.
And decades later, remains one of the most immediately recognizable vocal performances of the entire decade. Praised specifically for how much emotional complexity Knight packed into a voice that never once had to shout,
Oh, yes, he did.
to be believed completely. What makes her instrument so distinctive is a lower register unusually deep for a female lead vocalist of that era. A texture that gave Motown, and later Buddha Records, a genuinely different sound to work with, compared to the higher, brighter voices dominating radio at the time. Knight had performed since the age of 4, touring with family gospel groups long before most children learned to read. And that decades-long apprenticeship shows in how economically she uses her voice, never wasting a phrase, never reaching for an effect the song has not earned. Contemporary singers, studying soul phrasing, still return to this recording specifically to hear restraint, used as a form of power rather than its absence. Number 7. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye's studio recordings were remarkable, but it was on stage that his voice revealed a different kind of danger. And nowhere is that clearer than in the live performances of Distant Lover, captured during his 1973 tour. On record, the song is smooth, controlled, almost restrained. Live, Gaye pushed the vocal into territory that made audiences audibly react in real time. Extending phrases, sliding into falsetto runs that were not written into the original arrangement, responding to the crowd's energy with vocal choices that changed from night to night. The version captured on the live album from that tour became legendary, specifically because of a single extended note near the song's climax, held and shaped with a control that left the audience screaming before he had even finished the phrase. Gaye had spent years as a session drummer and background vocalist before becoming Motown's leading man, absorbing technique from every artist he worked alongside. And by the early 1970s, he had built a vocal instrument capable of moving between smooth falsetto and raw, almost gospel shout intensity within the same breath. What made Distant Lover different from his studio ballads was the visible risk. Live vocals leave no room for correction, no second take. And Gaye clearly understood the exposure and used it anyway, treating each performance as an opportunity to push his range further than the studio version ever attempted. Musicians who backed him on that tour described audiences becoming almost unmanageable during the song's peak moments. A reaction rarely produced by a purely vocal performance without theatrical staging. Decades later, that live recording is still cited by vocal historians as one of the most electrifying unscripted vocal moments committed to tape in the entire decade. Gaye was reportedly nervous before large tours during this period, a private anxiety that stood in stark contrast to the total command he projected once the music started. As though the vulnerability he carried off stage converted directly into the emotional stakes audible in his vocal choices once the lights came up. Bandmates who toured with him described a performer who genuinely did not know in advance how far he would push a note on any given night. Meaning even the musicians backing him were, in a real sense, listening for the first time alongside the crowd, unable to anticipate exactly where his voice was about to go next. Number 6. Roberta Flack. Roberta Flack trained as a classical musician before she ever became a soul singer, studying piano and vocal performance formally. And that background shaped a control over dynamics that few of her R&B contemporaries possessed. Killing Me Softly with his song, released in 1973, is built almost entirely on restraint, a vocal performance that spends most of its runtime deliberately quiet, deliberately controlled, refusing to give listeners the release they expect until precisely the right moment. Flack recorded the song after hearing a description of it from Laurie Lieberman, who had performed an earlier version inspired by watching Don McLean perform live. And Flack slowed the tempo considerably, stretching the song into something closer to a meditation than a pop single. That decision meant her voice had nowhere to hide. Every held note, every carefully placed breath, sat exposed against a sparse arrangement that gave her almost no instrumental cover. Producers reportedly worried the song was too slow, too understated for radio, until it went on to win Record of the Year at the Grammys and spend 5 consecutive weeks at #1. What makes the vocal remarkable under close listening is the precision of Flack's dynamic control, moving from near whisper to full voice, without ever losing the thread of the melody or letting the tempo drag the emotion down with it. She treats the song almost like an actor delivering a monologue. Each phrase weighted differently, some barely voiced at all. That classical training, rare among soul vocalists of the era, gave Flack a level of technical command that critics have returned to for decades, citing the recording as proof that restraint, properly executed, can be more powerful than any display of raw vocal force. Flack had originally built her career performing in Washington, D.C. supper clubs, singing everything from classical pieces to jazz standards, for small, attentive rooms rather than large arenas, and that formative environment shaped a vocalist who thought in terms of intimacy rather than spectacle, long before fame demanded otherwise. Musicians who accompanied her during that period recall an artist who would stop a rehearsal entirely over a single mistimed breath, treating vocal phrasing with the same rigor a conductor might bring to an orchestral score, a level of exacting control that few soul vocalists of her generation were formally trained to apply. Number 5. Al Green. Al Green's voice occupies a strange middle ground between gospel fervor and something almost conversational. And Love and Happiness, recorded in 1972 at Royal Studios in Memphis, captures that duality better than almost anything else in his catalog. Producer Willie Mitchell built the arrangement around Green's instincts, rather than forcing him into a fixed structure, and the vocal reflects that freedom, sliding between a smooth, almost murmured verse and sudden bursts of raw, gospel-rooted intensity that seem to arrive without warning. Green grew up singing in his family's gospel group before his father kicked him out of the house for listening to secular music. And that gospel foundation never left his voice, surfacing constantly in small vocal runs, sudden falsetto leaps, and the kind of controlled rasp that sounds spontaneous, but was the product of years of church performance. What makes Love and Happiness extraordinary is how unpredictable Green's phrasing feels, even after repeated listens. He rarely sings a line the same way twice within the song, stretching some words, clipping others short, letting his voice crack slightly at moments where a more polished vocalist would have smoothed the imperfection away. Mitchell reportedly encouraged that rawness rather than correcting it, understanding that Green's power came from precisely the moments other producers might have called mistakes. The song's slow-building arrangement gives the vocal room to breathe and shift without ever losing its groove. And by the time it reaches its extended outro, Green is essentially improvising, chasing a feeling rather than a fixed melody. Musicians and vocalists have studied this recording for decades, specifically because it resists easy imitation. A performance built on instinct that cannot be fully written down or reproduced through technique alone. Royal Studios itself played a role in shaping that sound. A small, tightly built room in Memphis, where the natural acoustics gave Green's voice a warmth engineers struggled to replicate anywhere else. and Mitchell reportedly refused offers to move sessions to larger, more modern facilities, specifically because of what that room did to a vocal take. Green has said in later interviews that he rarely knew exactly what he was going to sing before the tape started rolling, treating each take as closer to a spiritual event than a scripted performance, which is part of why no two live versions of Love and Happiness across his entire touring career have ever sounded quite the same. Number 4. Teddy Pendergrass. Teddy Pendergrass began his career as a drummer, not a singer, and that rhythmic foundation shaped a vocal delivery built on precision as much as power. By the time he recorded Turn Off the Lights as a solo artist in 1979, following his years fronting Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, Pendergrass had developed one of the most physically commanding baritones in R&B, a voice deep enough to feel almost architectural, capable of filling a room without any amplification trickery. What set him apart from other deep-voiced vocalists of the era was control at the bottom of his range, a place where most singers lose clarity and start to muddy into indistinct rumble. Pendergrass instead stayed articulate, even at his lowest, most intimate register, delivering lyrics with a directness that made the song's suggestive content feel less like performance and more like an actual private conversation captured on tape. Philadelphia International built much of its late 1970s sound around exactly this quality, positioning Pendergrass as a singer whose voice alone could carry sensuality without relying on innuendo in the lyrics to do the work. Live audiences reportedly reacted to his performances with an intensity that became something of a spectacle in itself. Women famously throwing hotel room keys onto the stage during his concerts, a reaction driven almost entirely by the physical weight of his voice, rather than his songwriting or stage choreography. Vocal coaches have since pointed to Pendergrass as a rare example of a baritone functioning as a lead instrument in a genre that historically favored higher, more flexible voices. Turn Off the Lights remains one of the clearest demonstrations of that power. A vocal performance that needed almost no ornamentation because the raw tone itself was the entire event. Producers at Philadelphia International reportedly mixed his vocals slightly forward compared to house standard practice, understanding that burying that particular voice beneath the lush strings and horns the label was known for would have wasted its most valuable asset. Pendergrass has said in interviews that he never consciously tried to sound seductive, insisting the tone was simply how his voice naturally sat. A claim that made the performance feel even more genuine to audiences who sensed, correctly, that there was no calculated technique behind it, only an unusually rare instrument being used exactly as it naturally functioned. Number 3. Aretha Franklin. By the time Aretha Franklin recorded Ain't No Way in 1968, released as the flip side to Chain of Fools, she had already spent her childhood singing gospel in her father's Detroit church, trained not by a vocal coach, but by years standing beside some of the greatest gospel singers in the country. That foundation produced a technical command that session musicians frequently described as intimidating to witness in person, a voice capable of moving between a controlled, almost fragile lower register and an enormous room-filling upper register within a single phrase. On Ain't No Way, her sister Carolyn Franklin wrote the song specifically to showcase that range. And the recording features a vocal performance so precisely controlled that the falsetto backing vocals, provided by singer Cissy Houston, had to match a bar set almost impossibly high. Franklin's lead vocal moves through the song with a kind of controlled devastation, never rushing, letting notes bend and ache exactly as long as the emotion required before releasing them. Producers at the session reportedly needed remarkably few takes, because Franklin arrived already understanding precisely how she intended to shape every phrase. A level of preparation that came from a lifetime of live gospel performance where mistakes were not an option. What makes the recording extraordinary under close listening is the sheer control at both extremes of her range. Moving from near whisper to full-throated power without ever sounding like two different voices. Critics and vocalists alike have referred to this recording for decades as a demonstration of technical mastery matched with raw emotional honesty. A combination that helped cement Franklin's reputation as the definitive vocal standard against which nearly every R&B and soul singer since has been measured. Musicians who played on Franklin's Atlantic sessions during this period have described a woman who often arrived at the piano herself, working out harmonic structure before anyone else in the room had fully grasped the arrangement. Meaning her vocal choices were never separate from the music itself, but built into its foundation from the very first rehearsal. That dual command, as both instrumentalist and vocalist, gave her interpretations a structural authority other singers simply could not access, since Franklin was never merely performing a song written for her. She was, in a very real sense, still composing it in real time, note by note, take by take. Number 2. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway studied music formally at Howard University, trained in theory and composition. Yet nothing about A Song for You, recorded in 1971, sounds academic. It sounds instead like a man singing directly, and only to one other person, stripped of performance instinct entirely. Hathaway's voice carries a warmth and vulnerability that vocal historians have struggled to fully explain technically, a tone that seems to invite the listener inward rather than project outward toward an audience. The recording features Hathaway both singing and playing piano simultaneously, and musicians who worked with him have described watching him shape a vocal phrase and a chord change at the same instant, as though the two were never separate decisions in his mind. That integration gives the performance an intimacy rarely achieved, even by vocalists working with a full band and a separate accompanist. Hathaway battled serious mental health struggles throughout his life. And while it would be reductive to attribute his vocal depth entirely to personal pain, many who knew him have said that the ache audible in his recordings reflected something genuinely difficult he carried privately. A Song for You would go on to be recorded by dozens of other artists over the following decades. Yet Hathaway's original version remains the reference point every subsequent singer is measured against, praised specifically for a vulnerability that later interpretations rarely fully recapture. Music critics have called it one of the greatest vocal performances in American recorded history, not for range or power, but for an almost unbearable sincerity that turns a simple piano ballad into something that still stops listeners mid-sentence more than 5 decades later. Collaborators who worked closely with Hathaway across his career described a musician who heard harmonic possibilities most trained ears missed entirely. Someone equally comfortable arranging a full orchestral chart or sitting alone at a single piano, yet who consistently chose the sparsest possible setting whenever his own voice was the instrument being featured. That instinct towards subtraction rather than addition, stripping every unnecessary layer away until only the essential emotional core remained, is a large part of why A Song for You still functions today exactly as it did in 1971, entirely unburdened by the production trends that date so much other music from the same period. Number 1. Minnie Riperton. Minnie Riperton could sing notes most vocalists cannot physically produce, and Lovin' You, recorded in 1974, exists almost entirely to prove it. Trained in opera as a teenager in Chicago, Riperton developed a 5-octave range that included the elusive whistle register, a technique so rare that most singers who attempt it produce something thin or unstable. Riperton's whistle notes on this recording remain clear, controlled, and precisely pitched, floating above the gentle arrangement with a purity that studio engineers reportedly had never captured on tape before. Producer Stevie Wonder, working closely with Riperton during this period, built the arrangement deliberately sparse, understanding that anything busier would compete with a voice that needed almost no support to fill the entire recording. The song's most famous moment arrives near the end, when Riperton ascends into that whistle register while singing her daughter's name, a decision that turned a gentle love song into something that still sounds almost supernatural 50 years later. Riperton would be diagnosed with breast cancer just 2 years after the song's release, and continued performing and recording even as her health declined. A fact that has retroactively deepened how listeners hear the fragility and purity in her voice. Vocal coaches consistently cite "Lovin' You" as one of the most difficult vocal feats ever committed to a pop recording. Not because of volume or power, but because of the extreme precision required to sustain a whistle register note in tune. In public, without the safety net modern pitch correction technology would later provide. No 1970s vocal performance demonstrates more clearly that the decade's greatest voices were not simply powerful. They were technically impossible, made to sound effortless by singers who had spent a lifetime earning that illusion. Riperton had studied under the same Chicago vocal instructor responsible for training several other major singers of her generation. And colleagues who trained alongside her have described a student who could demonstrate the whistle register almost casually during warm-ups. Treating a technique other singers spent years failing to develop as simply one more color available to her voice. That combination of formal opera discipline and natural gift is rarely found in a single vocalist. Which is part of why, decades after her death, no recording artist has managed to fully replicate what Lovin' You captured, a performance still held up as the benchmark against which every subsequent attempt at that register is measured, and still falls short.